This is a live recording of Should I Start a Podcast? I have a treat for you. If you want the edited version of this show, you will find it on all your favorite podcast players. Look for Should I Start a Podcast by me, Ronsley. It's good to have your company, whether it is live or on the recording of the live or on the podcast if it makes it through. But if you're a business owner podcaster and you have a story on how podcast has helped or hindered your business, I'd love to hear from you. So DM me and let me know of how that happened. I'd love to hear the story and how that went down. If you don't know, We Are Podcast 2022 is all on growth. It's happening in a couple of months. It's scary as hell, but it's exciting as well. So it's all about getting more listeners, more revenue, more credibility. So just check it out, like wearepodcast.com. You'll check out all the speakers that have been announced as well. Today, I have the legend that is Dave Jackson in the house. Now, I call Dave Jackson, amongst others, but the original Mount Rushmore face of podcasting, and I've referred to him in that way a few times. He has been around for, I feel like, ever. And I've learned a lot from him in my journey as a podcaster. People tell me now that, oh my God, Ronsley, you've been in podcasting for a long time. And Facebook reminded me a few weeks ago, a month ago, that I've been doing this for 10 years. But Dave Jackson has been doing it way longer than me. So I'm really excited to chat with him about podcasting, the state of podcasting right now, and his journey as a podcaster. So Dave, how are you?
Oh, Ronsley, happy to be here. Yeah, 17 years. That's hard to believe, but that's how long I've been doing it. So
That's
crazy.
that is crazy. Do you feel like I feel like I've just started? How do you feel about being around for 70? Because I was surprised when I got the Facebook memory of 10 years. Like I was really surprised. So how do you feel about the whole 17 years?
Yeah, I'm with you. It doesn't seem that long. The only thing I run into is there are times when I'll be like, oh, you know what we should talk about on this week's episode? And I'm like, oh yeah, I already did that. And then we should. So it's always about coming up with new takes on old topics and things like that. But over those years, it's progressed along from when I started, podcasts weren't in Apple yet, so it's crazy to watch everything, and it just keeps getting easier and cheaper and better, and it's fun to watch.
So you mentioned these topics. What are the topics that get recycled? What are the ones that keep coming back? Like what are the ones that you keep covering and have to find a new take on them?
Yeah, one is interviews. People love to talk about interviews and how do I find guests and how can I be a guest and how can I get my guests to share things and just all things interviews. How do I a lot of the one that always kind of confuses me is how do I find guests for my show? And I always kind of, without being too snarky, go, have you heard of this thing called the internet? And plus, every time you turn around, there's another, what somebody will do is they'll buy a dating script and it's supposed to help, people find each other, and they'll just change this from podcaster to guest. And it's all about the connection. And they're all about, we're the number one place to connect podcasters with guests. And I'm like, really? Because the person last week was the number one. And so it's always kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean,
But how do I grow my audience? That's another one. How do I start? All those ones that come up because they're just new people getting in all the time, and they have those same kind of 5 questions.
so you mentioned interviews. I want to ask you now, like for everyone starting a podcast that has an interview style show, like what should they be doing? Like what are the things that are, because here's the thing, in my world, there are business owners learning to become podcasters, not podcasters learning to become business owners. So it's like the other way around. And there are just these things that I feel just everyone should know about how to, have a good interview type show. So what are your suggestions for that?
Well, there are a couple things. Number one, it's cool to interview your customers if you can do it in a way that's not quite so obviously that it's a commercial, but when you can kind of talk about the industry that you're in, and we have this person, and oh, by the way, they're one of our customers. it's also really helpful at times to get customers. This is the strategy that I've seen a few people use. And you do a podcast about your industry, and then you approach someone and say, hey, you know, dear person with lots of knowledge about the industry, would you like to come on my show and share how brilliant you are? Versus, hey, can I pick your brain for 20 minutes? That doesn't work. But having somebody on your show, and then of course once the microphone is turned off, you go, so who are you using for this kind of service that I provide? And people are using that as an icebreaker that I see work a lot of times. But it doesn't always have to be an interview show. The interview show helps you grow your network, and that can be huge. But also it can be a solo show where you just talk to that one person who's listening. And I've seen people that will take, those, we talked about, topics that come up all the time, take those topics that come up all the time and either find somebody to interview about those, so it's an interview show, or just talk to that one person. Because what happens then, I have a member of the School of Podcasting once was in real estate, and they were just getting all these, how do I get my house appraised, and all these things that just kept coming up. And so I said, let's make those the episodes. And when somebody emails you with that kind of 101 question, you can still answer it via email. You don't want to be rude, but oh, by the way, we talked about this on the podcast. And he said, what happens then is your potential customer then goes over, and all those questions that you're like, oh, I hope I don't have to answer that again today. They're already there. And so they go through your back catalog. And then when they do come back to you, now it's not so much the 101 stuff. Now they're actually contacting you for the stuff that you really need to help them with. So it helps free. It's not the end of cold calling, but it helps free up your time for maybe the more important stuff that you're really needed to do.
So as someone who, is totally in the world of podcasting, like what are the stuff that really annoys the shit out of you? Like when it happens, what are the pet peeves of Dave Jackson?
I think what I will call witty banter at the beginning of a show that goes on way too long. And it's like, hey, today we're going to tell you how to earn 20% on your investments. But first, let me tell you about Mr. Whiskers. He is such a rascal, that little cat. And you're like, wait, what? I tuned in to hear about investments. I tuned into a show once just because I'm always listening to different shows, and it was on finance, but it was supposed to be from a female perspective. And the woman started off, and I felt bad because she was having a bad day because it was her birthday, but it really it felt like a therapy session. And the whole time I'm like, I'm kind of here to learn finance, and you're talking about, family issues and stuff. And I was like, yeah, that should have been edited out. So I think that's a big one. Some other ones are just horrible audio where you've decided that we're going to buy one microphone and stick it on a table where we're all about 3 feet away from it, so it sounds like we're in a cave. And I'm like, you just need to pretend you're Oprah. You get a microphone, you get a microphone, everybody gets the microphone. It's crazy. So that's one. We could go on. Do I need a website? Yeah. Have you ever heard of this thing called Google? Guess what Google searches through? Yeah, your website. So yeah, you need a website. So those are probably and just the person that contacts me and says, I love this question. What's the topic I can talk about that will require the least amount of work, but make the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time? And I'm just like, yeah, you shouldn't podcast. Just no, it's not the way it works.
I love hanging out with you, obviously, Dave, because you're so funny. You spoke about a couple of things there. One was, I have a similar pet peeve with editing, because that's what you're kind of referring to. Like, you're kind of referring to the fact that people are just publishing everything they're recording, right? They're not kind of separating the recording and the editing process, or process, depending on which part of the world you're from. But, and maybe that's something that we can talk about. Like, what, maybe there are like these easy ways for someone to just be smart about the editing process and get and actually, like, no one would ever read a blog post that's not edited, or like a book that's not edited. Like, why would they consume a podcast that's not edited, right?
Well, I always love the people that go, oh, we're just going to keep it real. And I was like, yeah, real boring, maybe. I don't know. I just was watching, because it came up on YouTube. it was Howie Mandel, who's a celebrity, interviewing another celebrity. And the celebrity looked up, and it's on YouTube. And they said, "Oh, you have a talking deer." So there's this deer head on the wall, and it's supposed to talk, except it's not. And so they must have spent, it was probably like a minute, maybe a minute and a half, but it was them going, "Wait, no, it's not talking yet. Wait, do this. Wait, Earl, can you get it to talk, Earl?" And we're listening to them troubleshoot. And I was like, in the end, the deer never talked. And I was like, why didn't you just cut that out? We just watched them troubleshoot for a minute and a half. So that's the thing always kind of makes me scratch my head. And what I do if I do an interview show is I listen to the question that I asked. And the first thing I listen for is, did they answer the question? Sometimes you'll get somebody that's kind of on some sort of publicity tour, and they're just doing a ton of interviews, and they've got their stock answers ready. And you ask them, "So what's your favorite type of pizza?" And they're like, "This one time I was in my car," and you're like, "Wait, what?" And they have this default answer. So I will let them answer that, but I also go, let's see, I asked them, "What's your favorite pizza?" They talked about their car for 10 minutes. I'm like, that's not making it to my audience.
Yeah.
I always feel like if I was a goalie, right? We're playing football in your world, soccer in mine, and I'm the goalie in front of the net.
Yeah.
And, when a guest hands me just a nothing burger, I'm just going to smack that out of here and go, no, and that's not getting to my audience. So,
And I think it's that protection of your audience that is really important. I feel like business owners are really good at, a prospect coming in and saying, "Hey, I want to use your services," and taking that prospect into a client. So when they create a podcast, they're creating it for clients as opposed to creating it for audience or creating it for community is probably a better way to say it. But it's actually creating it for audience, because if you get the basics of podcasting right, and correct me if I'm wrong, it is about having that share a year with your audience, like where they are kind of in as part of their ritual. You are in that ritual. Am I right in sort of thinking that?
oh, absolutely. When you deliver value, and I always tell people, record a few episodes, throw them away, but you really need to figure out how much time does it take to create an episode so that you can say, well, that took whatever, 10 hours to do that one episode. Do I have 10 hours a week to do this? And if the answer is no, then don't say I'm going to do a weekly podcast, or find somebody who can edit it for you, something like that. So I always say, try to figure out what your schedule is going to be, and then try to do that. And when you do that, now you're seen as trustworthy because, well, Dave's there every Monday. And then if you can somehow work in a story, I talked about, talking about your cat, but if you can explain maybe something about your industry or your business while telling a story, they kind of get to know you. And of course, you're delivering great value, so they like you. So there's the whole know, like, and trust. And that's where it really comes in. And I've had people tell me weird things like, "You're with me in the shower every Monday, Dave." And I was like, that sounds a little bizarre, but okay. But you become part of their routine. And that's kind of what you want. You want them to be, "Oh, Dave's my Wednesday morning drive to work" kind of thing.
Right.
And that really just helps build that, like you said, the relationship in the community.
Right. So School of Podcasting, you've been doing this forever, like forever. That before even we knew that there was a thing, there was a podcast coach. Dave Jackson was a podcast coach. I am thinking of rebranding this podcast, and I'd love to know your thoughts. Like, the reason for it probably is like, should I start a podcast is not really what it says on the tin. Like, it's not the label that, so this is for podcasters that already have a podcast and want to grow it, and kind of, it's like for podcasters, and kind of, should I start a podcast doesn't necessarily say that. So what are your thoughts on rebranding? Like, I'm 300 episodes in.
Yeah, it's been done. My very first podcast, I rebranded. I ended up with the third name was the one I ended up with. But because to me, a great test is you go to somebody and you say, "Hey, I have a podcast called Should I Start a Podcast? What do you think it's about?" And most people are going to go, "I don't know. You probably help people figure out if they should start a podcast or not." And if that's what the show's about, then keep that name. But if it's not, then don't. Then you have to kind of figure out, okay, who am I trying to reach, and what podcast would they listen to? And that's always kind of tricky sometimes. And in my case, I started off with, because again, it was in 2005, the musician cyber cooler, because back then we called it cyberspace, but then cyber got connected to sex. So I didn't want the word cyber anywhere near my show. So it was the musician's cooler, had a new logo put out as big water cooler, the musician's cooler, where musicians come to trade advice. And people are like, so it's like a wine cooler? And I'm like, did you not read the tagline? But it was still kind of not really obvious. And so eventually I rebranded again to the marketing musician. And people went, oh, this is about how to get more CD sales and more gigs and stuff. And I'm like, exactly. So that's kind of my test. If the name, when you ask somebody what is my show about, and the answer they tell you matches what the show is about, then that's a good name. A lot of times we try to get kind of cute. I know I had a friend of mine that was going to do a show about ham radio, and he came to me, he goes, I'm going to call it Faux Time. And I'm like, what is faux time? How do you spell that? And he goes, F-O time. And I go, I can think of some naughty words that go with F-O. And I go, are you sure you want to name it that? Because you have to think about what people are searching. And he was like, no, my audience is going to get it. Well, the customer's always right. So we launched Faux Time. And probably 3 weeks later, he's like, okay, how do I change my name? Because people were typing in ham radio and his show wasn't coming up because it wasn't in the title anywhere. And that's where sometimes if you kind of want to get kind of cute, you can do that. And then with a colon, this is the such and such show, colon, tagline. And the tagline can have your keywords in there. Because I think Apple is the one, they only search the name of the show, the name of the episode, and the author. They completely ignore the description. So that's kind of, disheartening. But it's like, that's what it is, because people just kept keyword stuffing it so hard that Apple was like, okay, we're just going to ignore that.
Interesting. That's good. That's good information to know. So in my case, I have kind of decided to go after podcasters who already have a podcast. And like, if you already have a podcast, you already put the reps in, or you are like, hey, I'm really close to launching, but not even then. Like, I'm actually literally going after podcasters because I have the same problems that I had when I started. I want more listeners. I want more credibility. I want more revenue, all from the podcast. So in your opinion, what do you think would be my next steps? Like, I mean, this is obviously, can I pick your brain session? Thank you, Dave.
Well, there's some things you want to do. Look for webs. I always come up with a bunch of names, and then I go over to insert wherever you buy your domains and see what domain is available to see if I can match a domain. And a lot of times the really good ones are taken, and that's where you can tack on show or cast or podcast or something to do that. But you also want to go see who does have that domain name. Sometimes you can buy it without giving them, both of your arms, maybe just one of them. They're usually pretty expensive. But also you want to make sure that somebody isn't doing something with that to where, hey, I'm going to start and then get an immediate cease and desist because of copyright or, something of that nature where they've got a trademark. So that would be it. And then I always I go back to the name test. I ask people, hey, I'm doing this new show. It's called this. What do you think it's about? And just kind of go from there. But it's not hard. The actual physical part of changing the name is you go into whoever your media host is, you change the name. If you're going to change, I'm assuming you're going to change the description, and you update your artwork and the key here is if your original artwork was logo.jpg, do not upload a second logo called logo.jpg. It has to be something like logo2.jpg, or the apps won't know that you've swapped out the artwork. And usually within 24 hours, the apps will update and you're off to the races.
Interesting.
So I would recommend, before we get off that, I would recommend also an episode that says, hey, just so you know, we're rebranding, because you always want to keep your audience in the loop, because depending on the different apps, sometimes it doesn't show the name of the show. It just shows the artwork. So if all of a sudden the artwork changes, they're like, wait, I didn't subscribe to that. They might be tempted to delete it. But if you say, hey, next Wednesday, you might see the artwork's going to change, and it's always a good idea to keep your audience in the loop.
Yep. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So let's get into the actual bits and pieces of what I actually want to talk about, other than just my advice for me. I really, really wanted to talk about how to increase shareability of your episodes. Like, there are things that we can do that I feel sometimes we take them for granted. Sometimes we do them and we forget we're doing them, or we do them half-heartedly. But like, in your opinion, as a podcaster for so many years, how can we increase shareability of the episodes we're producing? Because I think, first of all, we think that the work stops after the publication, but there's probably work to do after. But there's probably work to do beforehand as well. Just thoughts on increasing shareability?
Yeah, the first one comes in the actual podcast yourself. I interviewed two people. One was Jack from a show called the Darknet Diaries, and he gets like six-figure downloads every week. It's an amazing show.
Wow.
And I asked him, I go, how are you getting so many downloads? Like he puts a tremendous amount of work into it. It's kind of like an NPR style show, but the stories are about hackers and people getting hacked and things like that. So it's really well produced. And he said, I just asked my audience. And so I was like, no, seriously, what do you do? And he goes, I asked my audience. And he said, if you think about it, we're all kind of like, man, I wish we could join a network or something that I wish we had a team to tell the world that my show is here. And his answer is, well, you have a team. It's called your audience. And what he did was, first, he made sure his show was good. He would ask people, like, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is I'm going to tell everybody, how likely are you to share this with a friend? Because that's what you're looking for. And what I hear a lot, and I get this, is anytime we start to promote ourselves, we get really nervous. We feel awkward, and we feel like in the States here, we used to call it like a 1970s used car salesman whose goal was to get this car off the lot. It was a bucket of bolts. And I asked somebody once, and she said, I just feel salesy. And I go, so you're telling me your podcast is a bucket of bolts then? And she goes, well, no, I worked on this a long time. And I was like, okay, so you're actually helping people. And she said, yeah. And I said, so don't feel salesy. You're asking them, how can I help you? And so instead of saying things like, hey, if you kind of maybe, like, I don't know, you don't have to, but like, the website is .com, and okay, thanks. And you're like, wait, what? Whereas if they go, hey, I see we're at the 18-minute mark, and obviously you still like this. Hey, could you do me a favor? If you're probably listening to this on your phone, and there's probably a share button right there in the upper right-hand corner, if you know somebody who would benefit from this, could you click that button and send that to them? Boy, it would just mean the world to me. And then, probably work in your website address in there as well. So that's one that you do in the podcast. But another thing that I just kind of scratch my head on is, on your website, you should have a page that makes it really easy to subscribe in Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon. Those are like the top 4. And the reason for that is, if you say, hey, go to schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe, I've just now reinforced my brand. I'm not having to tell you, hey, go find me. That's the one. Hey, you can find me wherever fine podcasts are. I'm in all the big apps. Okay, well, I go back many moons ago. I worked as a grocery bagger. And if I'd be on my knees and I'm throwing whatever noodles on a shelf, if somebody said, hey, young man, can you tell me where the green beans are? I didn't say, oh, they're over in aisle 3 where all fine vegetables are. No, I would actually take them over and grab the green beans and put them in the cart, because if the green beans were in the cart, that money was going to pay for my paycheck. So I made it, made it so easy for them to get the content. And so when I hear people say, find me, and I'm like, well, that makes it sound like you're lost and you're missing a branding opportunity. And also, if they know it's just, schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe, they might share that with their friends. Oh, I found this new show. Just go to that. Well, if you start linking to that website, that has a potential to boost your SEO. So that's one I always kind of scratch my head on. Or they'll use and there's nothing bad against Linktree or all these other, services where you go and you put links. And I'm like, you already have a service that you can put a bunch of links on. It's called your website. And so, quit spending $10 to, this link service. Just send people to your website and make a page that has everything that's on your, whatever account, Linktree, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm so glad I asked that. So I decided, like, I was going to kind of cover a few big topics. One was increasing shareability, and I love the fact that you first said improve your show. Right, that is so important because otherwise, it doesn't matter what strategy you do to add new listeners. You like are just losing them.
Yeah, I was on a small group of churches that were trying to grow their memberships, and all three of us were in. We felt we were in a pretty safe space, and we're like, "Well, do you recommend people go to your church?" And everybody in the room was like, "No, it's awful." And I was like, "Well, I think we found the reason why nobody's,
Mm-hmm.
why your membership isn't growing." And it's the same thing with your show. If it's not something that people like, "Oh, you got to hear this," this is an amazing episode. I didn't even know this was available, and that's the kind of stuff that gets people to share it. I think it was Jacobs Media, probably about 3 years ago, put out a report, and they said 70% of podcasts are found via word of mouth, and so just make it easy to spread and
Yeah.
have a good show so that people go, "Oh, this is exactly what we're looking for."
Ah, so important. So awesome. All right. So increasing shareability, that's great. Thank you for that. That whole thing is just like gold of what you just kind of put out there. The next thing I wanted to cover was repurposing. So now, there's so much that can be done with the audio that is created or the audio that's made. What are your thoughts on how it should be used and how can primarily, I suppose, not only used for I think it should be used for getting attention to the podcast. So, what are your thoughts on how that goes down, the repurposing part of the podcast?
Yeah, I do this is the same way we're doing here on Saturday. I do a live call-in show, and then I take that, strip down the audio, pull out the horrible parts. Because with a live show, that's actually live where we have a chat room. We make it so people can jump into the video with us and ask questions. And there are times when people call in and we're like, "Hey, what's your question?" And then they give us 20 minutes about their backstory, and we're like, "And is there a question in here?" So there's some editing going on with that, but that is one where it starts off as a video, ends up as audio, and then if I had a bigger team, I would take some of those and snip them into little things for social
Yeah.
and post them there just to let people know. And I always think all that's a great idea. I'm actually thinking right now, I just started a TikTok channel. I know I'm way late, but I was like, I, well, I came to the conclusion that if I was worried about privacy, I think I lost that somewhere in like 92. So I don't know what I'm worried about. But I think when I start doing videos for my YouTube channel, I'm going to make sure I don't move around too much so that I can do one widescreen and throw that on YouTube and then crop it for a phone and put that on, Instagram, TikTok, and reels and shorts on YouTube and
Yep.
things of that nature. So if you kind of know where you're going to end up, you can kind of then plan better on how to arrange your content and where it's going to go. And the one that I still kind of scratch my head on is audiograms, because a lot of people, they'll spend 45 minutes listening to their entire episode to find this 10-second mark where somebody says, "Yes, hard work is definitely worth it." And I'm like, okay, but couldn't you have just, instead of spending 45 minutes on that, couldn't you have just looked at the camera and said, "Hey, this week I'm interviewing Ronsley, and he said hard work is definitely worth it. Check it out at insert website, blah, blah, blah." And there you go. That would take 3 minutes versus an hour and a half. So sometimes I think the audiogram can be a tremendous time suck, which is why I hear people saying, it's not worth it. Well, it's because they spent 2 hours finding the perfect 4-second clip.
Yeah.
I'm like, I just make the 4-second clip and explain why you're excited to have so-and-so on your show. So, but I asked somebody once, I said, "How do we know if audiograms are working?" And he said, "Well, if you're giving them to your guest, go to their guest Twitter or Facebook, and if they're sharing it, then the audiogram is working because that's kind of what you made it for." He goes, "If they're not, then maybe you need to go back and look at what you're doing to, create an audiogram and things like that." I hear a lot of people say they take up too much time.
Yeah. Well, when I think about increasing shareability, going back a step in our conversation, I think that if you're interviewing someone and you can't convince them in the time that you've spent together to share your episode, then something is up and something is wrong. So I feel like that is probably the first step. If you can kind of get your guest to share your episode, you've kind of almost lends itself that you can get someone else to share your episode. But if you can't get someone that you've spent so much time chatting with to share the episode, then chances are someone who's never met you and just come across your podcast, it becomes hard for them to kind of like do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's you and I both know Pat Flynn. And if I interviewed Pat Flynn and walked him through the whatever it was, the Green Academy thing that he did, and it was his job, and he was a drafting guy, an architect or whatever, he's not going to share that with his audience. His audience has heard that story 4,000 times at this point.
Yeah.
So if you really want somebody to share it, you need to ask questions that are still on point for your audience, but maybe something that they haven't talked about. To me, I always get a big old smile on my face if I'm doing an interview and somebody goes, "Ooh, that's a really good question. I've never talked about that before." And I was like, "Yes, I'm in the, I'm hitting in the right spot." Eric Newsom has a great book called Make Noise, and he's from NPR. He's got a tremendous background. And he said, when you look at your guest, think about what's the one question that only this person can answer. And I was like, "Ooh, that's a really good question. That's a good point." And so I've tried that a few times. When I had Eric on my show, I said, "What steps did it take to get hired at NPR?" Because he's the only person I've ever had on my show that had a job at NPR. And so that's a good place to start as well. And just look for anything with stories and try to, of course, the obvious thing, don't ask yes, no questions, things like that.
So with your longevity was the word I'm going for in podcasting. When you look back, what's your most proudest moment, or what jumps out when I ask that question? Like what memory?
It's actually kind of easy. I had a guy email me, and he said, "Hey, Mr. Jackson," which is always weird because that's my dad. And he says, "I just want to let you know I heard your podcast, and there was one episode especially where it said podcasting can kind of give you a purpose." And he went through and he explained how he thought he had cancer. His best friend from forever ago had been killed in a car accident, and he had lost his job. And to make a long story short, he was going to kill himself. And he said, "I heard your podcast about sometimes podcasting can give you a purpose." And he said, "I was going to kill myself on Halloween, which is October 31st. He said, "But instead, I decided to start a podcast. And I just want to let you know, I credit you with saving my life." And at the time, this was years ago, I was like, podcasting in the basement next to the water heater. And I'm like, that was not I was hoping I could get somebody to join my membership site. And it's hard to make me speechless, but that was one that I just kept reading. And I eventually, what was great about it is he had his phone number in his signature. So I called him on Halloween. And I said, "Hey, this is Dave Jackson." He's like, "It is not." And I go, "It is." And he's like, "Really?" And I go, "Yeah." I go, "It's October 31st. I said, "Look, man, I need all the listeners I can get. I can't have anybody offing themselves. Come on, trying to make a light of the situation." And I call him every Halloween if I can remember. Last year I missed and we called him later, but I call him every Halloween just to say, "How's it going?" We catch up with each other, and occasionally he'll come to a podcast conference, but that's one. I mean, obviously, there have been other things. My job at Libsyn I got because of my podcast. I'm in the Hall of Fame. That really wrecked my brain for a long time. But having somebody say, "I credit you with saving my life," that was not on the things of achievements I was hoping to do when I started my podcast.
I mean, we spoke about this when you were here in Brisbane last, about the whole Hall of Fame and it racking your brain. Where are you with it at now, and how have you gotten to this point?
Well, it's one of those things. I had a business coach that said, "Why aren't you mentioning that?" And I was like, "That's not." Again, I don't want to feel salesy. Don't want to. It's like a weird humble brag. And he's like, "Look, how many people can say that?" I go, "I think we're up to 14." He's like, "Start introducing yourself as a Hall of Fame podcaster." And I was like, "Okay." And it really came down to how I got over it was I just had to be myself. and I didn't have to worry about, is this Hall of Fame material or things of that nature. So
Mm-hmm.
it's something I'm definitely, you know, more comfortable with, I guess. I feel, I guess I've earned it at this point. I've grown into
Mm-hmm.
being comfortable with it. And, it still doesn't get me any free groceries or anything like that, but there's always hope.
It's like my TEDx talk being made a TED talk
Yeah.
is like one of those things. And this is another, like, this is like, to your point, right? I was similar. I would never want to say these kind of things, and I was in a room of like, I think 200 people, and they were all, I don't know, authors and, you know, interesting people here in Brisbane, actually. And someone asked the question, the speaker asked the question, I don't even remember who the speaker was, saying who's done a, TEDx talk at the time. And I didn't want to put my hand up going, this is going to be weird, but no one put their hand up. So I didn't put my hand up, but the three people mentioned Ronsley. So then I was like, oh, okay, I will stand up. And I was the only person in this room. And I was like,
Mm.
that is crazy. What stories have I been telling myself? That's mental. Yeah.
That's
So,
amazing, though.
yeah, it is absolutely too cool. So, let's talk about improving your show, because you mentioned that that's like
Mm.
one of the things that maybe is not spoken about enough. What are some things that we can do to improve our show? We spoke about editing, removing things that are not important. How can we, make a better show?
Yeah, I think it boils down to, you have to really know who it is you're trying to connect with. I run into this problem all the time. Every January, I do a very podcasting 101. And that's fine because everybody and their brother's like, this is the year we're going to start a podcast. But I also know there's a fair number of people that listen to my show that already have a podcast and they're trying to figure out how to grow it. And so there's a part of me that goes, should I split this into two shows? Should I make one kind of like how to launch your podcast and another one about growing? And I think about that every year.
Mm,
Right now, everything is together. I always just tell people, because I have a number of different shows about podcasting, and I'm like, look, if you want to get all my stuff, it's always at the School of Podcasting. So we talk monetization, we talk growth, we talk starting and things like that. But when it comes down to making it better, I think it really does boil down to, who is my audience, what do they want, and then it's kind of tricky because you have to give them what they want, but you also have to figure out, why am I doing this?
yeah.
And so if it's to grow your membership or sell more books or spread the word or whatever it is, you have to figure out, okay, how can I achieve the content that I need to attract this listener while still achieving my goal? And that's where you kind of have circles and they overlap, and the part that overlaps is the part that you need to talk about. But the one that I hands down know needs to be done more, and nobody wants to do it, is you need to find somebody not named mom or your best friend to give you honest feedback about it. And this is where you need to ask yourself, like, hey, here's this episode. I'm making this podcast for you, and I want it to be the best podcast ever just for you. So if you could listen to this episode, and I'm going to ask you some questions about it. So they listen to the episode and like, great, did you listen to the whole thing? And if not, when did you tune out?
Mm,
And that's kind of hard to hear. And
mm,
then you go, okay, great. And then, like I mentioned earlier, Jack has the, how likely are you to refer a friend?
yeah.
What did you like about it? What did you dislike about it? And Jordan Harbinger has a great quote where he says, most people, when they ask for feedback, are really just asking, hey, can you agree with everything I've done up to this point?
Mm,
And we have to be open to suggestions. If you think about it, authors have a rough draft, actors have a dress rehearsal, athletes have a preseason. We typically don't, those people don't go public with the first thing they did.
mm,
And again, if we go back to that whole, hey, I just spent 10 hours on this, I don't want to just delete it.
yeah.
And I get that. Nobody wants to waste their time, but we also have to realize that maybe that's not quite ready for prime time yet. And Ron Howard, the famous actor, director, he's got a
Mm,
gazillion Oscars and Emmys and such. When he puts out a new movie, he still puts it in front of some sort of focus group and watches from the back because he wants to make sure that his content is engaging the way he wants it to. Like if you're you have a scene in a movie and you want people to feel emotional and maybe cry, and you put it in front of the focus group and they're all laughing because it was horribly acted. Well, we got to go back to the drawing board. And so you want to make sure that your your audience is getting what they want, and you're hopefully achieving the goal that you have for the show, and go from there. And I'm not sure we're all open to that. That's something I see,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I know, I've seen different places that offer that, and I talk to them and they're like, yeah, it's hard to get clients. And I was like, it's that whole, and I think many people think that getting feedback means, hey, I'm just going to put my hand on this table and you just whack it with a big old mallet. And it's like, well, we're also going to point out the things that you do good.
Yeah.
It's not like your whole show is horrible, but we're worried about that 1-star review, and we can't name a single 5-star review that we've had. So
Yeah.
that's something that takes a little, I think, maturity and a little extra set of skin maybe to
Yeah.
to get through. But in the end, it doesn't make any sense to spend money on ads and promotion if the show's not resonating with your target audience.
Yeah. 100%. So good. I want to just cover this mistake that business owners make and sort of come back to you and kind of like ask you for your thoughts on it. But I'm just going to riff for a second, Dave, if you would indulge me. One of the mistakes that
Yeah.
business owners make is number 55. So we have a list. If you want the list, go to mistakes.wearepodcast.com. We've got a the top 10 and how to avoid and fix them. So go get that. This is actually a extensive list that we have. So we have number 55 today, which is having bad time management that makes a podcast a constant stream of deadlines. Now, I've been in that phase when, it's just been, I have to record today for publishing tomorrow. And when you start a podcast, I suppose that's the first thing that you'll end up doing. But a lot of people talk about batching, and you hear podcasters say, you should batch your podcast. But what exactly does that mean? And that single term, batching, will fix this constant stream of deadlines problem that most podcasters feel like they're in, because there are lots of spinning plates and kind of feels like you're constantly doing stuff for the podcast when it can be done better. For example, now this particular live recording, when it actually comes out on the podcast, will be in January 6th, I think, if I'm correct. So it is not that the recording has to be done today for whenever you're putting out your show. But my show is different. Maybe your show is different. So maybe you go into seasons. Maybe you do a different way of recording your podcast. But that's not all. Once you record, you have this responsibility of producing it and editing it, producing it, and then you have a responsibility of telling people about it. So there's all these little things that need to be done, and a system and a process and a checklist will help you massively to make this like not a constant stream of deadlines, or just give it to someone to get it done. I'm keen to hear what Dave thinks about, because you would hear this a lot, Dave. Like I just don't have the time to make a podcast. What is the what's the like I find the podcast being the best business development tool that I've ever seen. But how do you say to someone who says just have no time for a podcast, like what's the argument that counteracts that?
Yeah, there are a couple things. Because first, it's I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about. So I use Evernote. There are tons. There's Notion. There's all sorts of different note taking stuff, and you don't have to write War and Peace, but you can just write, what is a B2B podcast is something I'm looking at, because I heard that phrase a lot, and I was like, okay, that's something my audience might ponder on. So I'm just going to write that down, and then later I'll do some research, maybe figure out what angle is, things like that. So you have those great ideas in the shower and in the car and wherever it is, usually someplace that you can't take it, but have some way of capturing that, because that's half the grind, is what am I going to talk about? And you lose topics like that. And then with guests, definitely use something like a scheduling link, and make it easy for them to find a time when you're available, things like that. That can be a grind. We don't do the days anymore where you go, is Tuesday, Thursday, or Friday better? You let them pick and go from there. And then Rounsley has a phenomenal email that he sends out that really sets the expectations of the guests. It's like, be in a quiet room, have headphones on. He's really letting them know exactly what to do, because again, that is one of those hurdles. It's easy to get over. You're just setting expectations. Look, you can't call me from the road on your phone on speaker. That's just not going to work. So it's, again, kind of goes back to more planning equals less editing. And the batch thing is great. I always say, pay with whatever you have. If you have more money, then hire somebody to do the editing. If you have, not enough money, but more time, then do that. The problem is, oh, Dave, I don't have time or money. And that's exactly what Ron was saying. I'm like, okay, maybe we need to figure out, maybe we don't need to be, watching those Friends and Seinfeld reruns. We could skip those. But it definitely is. I am a person that is not good at this. I do it when I have to. So if I see I'm going to be, speaking at a conference or something like that, and I'm like, I don't want to try to record this in a hotel room, I will then batch a few episodes ahead of time. Why I don't do that all the time? Because it's very nice to have 2 or 3 ready to go. And that way, when life happens, you're not struggling and trying to, frantically put things together. It's definitely a great idea, because usually, no matter what unless you're doing a news show, where you're talking about, well, today so-and-so did such and such, you can't batch that. But pretty much everything else, you can find some sort of evergreen topic that you can talk about, have it just set aside so that when, the car breaks down and you've got to spend the whole day at the shop or whatever's going on, life happens, you've got something you can pull into it.
Yeah. Cool. Amazing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, schoolofpodcasting.com is where you go to find everything that Dave does. Go check it out. He's got like an amazing show. And I think, is that the show where you review other people's podcasts, or is that another podcast?
No, that's another one. But that's another example of just businesses. When I first started, people were like, hey, I just want to talk into the mic. Do you know anybody who does editing? And I'm like, yeah, me. And then eventually I had people that would say, hey, can you listen to my show and tell me if it's any good? And for, probably 5 months, I did that for free, just trying to be a nice guy. And then it dawned on me that I was giving away all this time. So there's a show I do with a radio veteran called the Podcast Review Show, where we go over your show and your website and your goals again to make sure everything's in alignment. And then I started a show that wasn't supposed to be real, called the Podcast Rodeo Show, talking about a really bad name there, because I have to explain it. It's where I grab a random podcast and see how long I can hang on. And and I designed that show where I literally grabbed just a random podcast, and as I listened to it, I was like, okay, the one I just listened to, one of the co-hosts had been drinking for 8 hours. I do not recommend that before getting on the microphone, because they were doing the introduction, and the one guy's like, I'm Ty. And when they got to number 2, he's like, I'm Rufus. And I'm like, wait, why is Rufus laughing already? Ty's name isn't that funny. So I was going to quit the show, and my audience was like, no, you're saying everything we're thinking. And I try to be constructive. I don't want to just say your show stinks, but I was like, hey, here's an easy fix for your microphone problem, and maybe you should move this to the end. And so I try to be constructive, but that's just a show I started just to test another media host, and I went to kill it. And my audience was like, no. So that's another one.
So cool. Well, where can people find your work and connect with you, Dave?
Schoolofpodcasting.com is my main website. And as much as I hate Linktree stuff, if you go to powerofpodcasting.com, I am testing that whole idea. I try to stay open to things, and that one's interesting because I can see how many times people clicked on stuff. So but my main site is schoolofpodcasting.com.
Great. Well, thank you for the time, and thank you for doing this, and thank you for laying the foundation. I actually give you credit a lot for laying the foundation for me coming along and doing the things that I have achieved, is because of people like you that have been keeping the podcasting flag going. So thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate you and all the work that you've done. So thank you.
Ronsley, thanks for having me, man. This was a blast.
Yeah, I loved it.